I know the subject of greed strikes you as maybe being a little odd for a Mother's Day message, but I hope that you'll see what I'm getting at, because if your mother was anything like my own, my mom taught me the value of having what you had and treating it with respect. For instance, I had a conversation with Gabriel. He's one of our ROTC boys, and they raised a lot of money yesterday, and so to thank the ROTC, they put on a big spread. And so apparently the meal that was provided to him was huge, so big that he couldn't even get to his dessert. And you know, kids like Gabriel, they can eat like a horse, but even that was too big. But his sergeant told him, you eat everything that's on your plate, because otherwise it would be disrespectful. And I get that. I mean, I think that's a good message. In my house, it was like, take what you want, but eat what you take. You just don't leave waste. And so, as in growing up, I think I've learned a lot of very valuable life lessons, and one of them has to do with what do we do with our skills and our talents and our abilities and our wealth as well. So, as the text of the message today, I've chosen 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6, which is on the overhead. Be content with who you are, and don't put on airs. God's strong hand is on you, and He'll promote you at the right time. The picture that you see on the overhand is a little old-fashioned. It's downtown New York, probably circa 1940. It's a popcorn stand that was on wheels. And I show you that picture because of the story. A businessman in New York would buy popcorn from this popcorn stand every day after lunch. And the guy that was running the stand was this old street vendor. And one day, the businessman, who had made a habit of purchasing the popcorn from this peddler, saw that the peddler was closing up his stand, and it's like only noon. And so he asked the popcorn salesperson, is something wrong? And a smile then wrinkled the seller's leathery face, and he said, by no means, all is well. Well, then why are you closing your stand? He said. And the peddler said, so I can go to my house, sit on my porch, and sip tea with my wife. The starched businessman, though, objected. But the day is still young. You can still sell. And the peddler said, well, no, there's no need to. I've made enough money for today. Enough? That's crazy. You should keep working. And so the spry old man stopped and stared at this well-dressed visitor and said, and why should I keep working? Well, so you can sell more popcorn. And why should I sell more popcorn? Because the more popcorn you sell, the more money you make. The more money you make, the richer you become. And the richer you are, the more popcorn stands that you can buy, the more popcorn stands that you can buy to then hire new peddlers to sell the popcorn at your new popcorn stands. So they'll be selling your product and you'll become even richer. And then when you have enough, you can stop working, sell your popcorn stands, stay home, sit on the porch with your wife, and drink tea. And the vendor just smiled at him and said, I can do that today. So I guess I have enough. Can you imagine somebody telling you I'm rich enough? I mean, that phrase is going the way of the dinosaur. We love to supersize our French fries, right? We love to supersize our television screens. I mean, we even sometimes supersize our closets. And I read a quote from a woman named Linda Kuhlman, and I think it's insightful. Here's what she said. We are a nation that believes in having it all. In 1950, American families owned one car and saved up for a second. In 2000, nearly 1 in 5 families owned 3 cars or more. Americans shell out more money for garbage bags than 90 of the world's 210 countries spend on everything. Indeed, America has double the number of shopping malls as it does high schools. Here's another stat. In 1900, the average person living in the United States considered or wanted 72 different things and considered 18 of that 72 absolutely essential. Today, the average person wants 500 different things and considers 100 of them absolutely essential. And our obsession with stuff carries a really, really heavy price tag. The average American family devotes a full 1/4 of its disposable income to pay outstanding debt, and we spend 110% of that same spendable income simply trying to manage it. Who can keep up? I mean, we no longer measure ourselves by the Joneses next door, do we? We measure ourselves against the star on the screen or the stud on the magazine cover. That's how we measure ourselves. Hollywood's diamonds would make yours look like a Cracker Jack toy. And who can ever satisfy Madison Avenue? And the answer is no one. And for that reason, Jesus warns in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, be on your guard against every form of greed. You see, greed comes in many different forms. Greed for approval, greed for attention, greed for applause, greed for status, greed for the best office or the fastest car or the prettiest date. Greed may have many faces, but it speaks one language. It's the language of more. Epicurus noted, quote, nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little. Let me repeat that. Nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little. And do you remember what Rockefeller said when he was asked how much money is enough? One day, John D. Rockefeller was strolling along. He was a bazillionaire back in his day. And a reporter came up and said, how much money is enough, Mr. Rockefeller? And he responded very casually, just a little bit more. That was his answer. How much is enough? Well, it's just a little bit more. And I think it's really wise of the one who wrote the following. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. It's taken from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 5, verse 10, likely written by Solomon. You see, greed has a growling stomach, and you feed it, but in doing so, you risk a lot more than acquiring budget-busting debt. You risk losing your purpose. You see, greed can seduce you right out of the place where God wants you to be, what I would call the sweet spot. And if you've done anything athletically, you know what it's like to hit the sweet spot, whether you're a golfer, maybe a baseball player, or perhaps even a football player or a hockey player, whatever sport, there's usually, if you're striking something with an instrument, it's like that sweet spot. You don't even really feel it. It just takes off with a golf shot or a baseball. You talk to a baseball player who hit a home run, and he'll tell you that he didn't even feel it because it just connected at the really perfect time on the really precise part of the bat that sent the ball traveling 435 feet. It's the sweet spot. And if we get too consumed with greed, it allows us to then step outside of where we should be, that sweet spot. And I think we've all seen that happen before. I want you to go back to the popcorn peddler for just a minute. You know, he had one stand and one job, and he managed both with great skill and great talent. But though his daily sales had been met that day, sometimes it doesn't necessarily meet his tastes. So to make more money, as the business person was encouraging, he buys more stands. And to supervise the additional stands that he has, he abandons his own stand. So the street vendor no longer sells, he manages, which is fine if he was designed to be a manager. But suppose he was made to sell. Suppose he swaps the open streets and the river of people and personalities that come to his stand every day, and he substitutes that for 4 walls, a desk, and a green eye shade. Will he give up more than he gains? God's answer to that very question lies in Scripture's first parable. And when we think about parables, we think about parables taken out of the New Testament because Jesus would use parables quite often. But did you know that the first parable actually is in the Old Testament? Long before readers pondered the stories of the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, they reflected on a parable about trees. And it's a person named Jotham that tells the story. Now, a little background. Jotham was one of Gideon's sons and was the sole survivor of a 70-man massacre. Abimelech, which was Jotham's brother, had authorized the slaughter. And Abimelech had sought to kill anyone who would keep Abimelech from the throne. So Jotham comes out of hiding just long enough to address the citizens of Israel and tell them this story. And you can find it in Judges chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. But here's what it says. Once upon a time, the trees decided to elect a king. First they said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But it refused, saying, "Should I quit producing the olive oil that blesses both God and people, just to wave back and forth over the trees?" Then they said to the fig tree, "Then you be our king." But the fig tree also refused, saying, "Should I quit producing my sweet fruit just to wave back and forth over the trees?" Well, then they said to the grapevine, You be our king." But the grapevine replied, "Should I quit producing the wine that cheers both God and the people, just to wave back and forth over the trees?" Then all of the trees finally turned to the thorn bush and said, "Come, you be our king." And the thorn bush replied, "If you truly want to make me your king, come and take shelter under my shade. If not, let the fire come out from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon." You see, using the parable, Jotham is warning the Israelites against the thorny Abimelech. And using this same parable, God warns us against greed-driven promotions. And he does it in this way. The trees entice the olive tree, the fig tree, and the grapevine with a throne room invitation. "Hey, come, be our king." And one by one, they refuse the offer. The olive tree wants to keep giving oil. The fig tree wants to keep giving figs. And the vine wants to keep bearing grapes. All have refused to pay the price of what would have been a promotion, because these plants took pride in their posts. I mean, why abandon fruitfulness? In the end, it's only the thorny thorn bush that accepts the offer. And so the story instructs, be careful. Because sometimes, church, in a desire to be great, one ceases being any good at all. And what good is a thorn bush? I mean, not much, unless you like getting stuck, right? Not every teacher is always the best person equipped to be the principal of the school. Not every carpenter may have the skill to lead an entire crew. Not every musician should be an orchestra conductor. Promotions might promote a person right out of his or her sweet spot. For the love of more, we might lose our purpose. So if trees ever offer you royalty, you don't have to take it. And here's another one. And just because a king offers you armor, you don't have to wear it. Because David didn't. You know, when he volunteered to go mano a mano against Goliath, King Saul tried to clothe David, the shepherd boy, with a soldier's armor. I mean, after all, Goliath stood over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and he wore 125 pounds of a coat of mail. 125 pounds. That's probably as much as David weighed. He had a bronze leggings, and he carried a javelin with a spear that at the tip of the spear, the tip alone weighed 15 pounds. And I'm not making this stuff up. You can find out in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 4 through 7. And what about David? Oh, he was well prepared. He had a slingshot. I mean, that's like a VW Bug playing chicken with an 18-wheeler. Or it's like a salmon daring the grizzly, come get me. When Saul saw David all pimpled and Goliath all rippled, King Saul did what any Iron Age king would do. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 38, Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. But David, we find out, refused it. And look at what this wise young man did. This is 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 39. David put it on, referring to Saul's armor, strapped the sword over it, took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such a thing before. Remember, David is a shepherd. I can't go in these, he protested. I'm not used to them. So he took it off. So David rejects the armor, selects the stones, lobotomizes the giant, and teaches us a powerful lesson in the process. What fits others may not fit you. Just because someone hands you armor, you don't necessarily have to wear it. Just because someone gives you advice, or a job, or a promotion, you don't necessarily have to accept it. Let your uniqueness define your path in life. The past 4 weeks, I've been trying to encourage each of you to spend time in God's Word and spend time with yourself, finding out who God created you to be. You are uniquely designed. You are uniquely created. 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we talked about a lesson that I called Unique, with an emphasis on Y-O-U, unique. Then a couple weeks ago, we talked about living life not backwards, but looking backward and seeing what passions drove you as a youth or as a young adult. What got you all excited? And then try and see, does that project in some way who you might be in the future? And now we're talking about making sure that we know who we are, because if we don't, we can get very easily seduced to be someone that God didn't make us to be. In Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3, it says, "You, Lord, give perfect peace to those who keep their purpose firm and put their trust in you." And I would encourage you, church, as I have been for the past several weeks, examine your strengths. Look at your gifts. Paul, in writing the church in Rome, in Romans chapter 12, verse 3 said, have a sane estimate of your capabilities. In other words, don't heed greed, because greed makes a very poor job counselor. She sells fig trees and tells them to bear no figs. She tells olive trees to bear no oil. And she tells vines to bear no grapes. That's not a great consult. And I would encourage you not to consult her. The Hebrew writer in chapter 13, verse 5 says, don't be obsessed with getting more material things. Be relaxed with what you have. Because isn't the right job with a little better than the wrong job with a lot? In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 16, the writer says, it is better to have little with fear for the Lord than to have great treasure with turmoil. Or as a Japanese proverb says, even if you sleep in 1,000-mat room, you can only sleep on one mat. Don't let the itch for things or the ear for applause derail you from your God-intended design. In his book, A User's Manual, Money, Bob Russell describes a farmer who once grew very discontent with his farm. He griped about the lake on his property always needing to be stocked and managed, how the hills had humped roads, forcing him to drive up and down, and those fat cows lumbering through his pasture. I mean, all the fencing and all the feeding, it was just a massive headache. So he decided to sell the place and move somewhere nice. So he calls up a real estate agent and made plans to list the farm for sale. So a few days later, the agent phones, seeking his approval of the advertisement that she intended to place in the local paper. So she read the ad to the farmer. It described a lovely farm in an ideal location. It was quiet and peaceful. It was contoured with rolling hills, carpeted with soft meadows, nourished by a fresh lake, and blessed with well-bred livestock. The farmer said, "Would you read that ad to me again, please?" After hearing it a second time, the farmer said, "You know, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to sell this place after all. I've been looking for a place just like this my entire life." And I think Paul would have applauded that farmer because he learned the same lesson. Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, "I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." So before you change your job title, examine your perspective on life. Success is not defined by a position. It's not defined by a pay scale. It's defined by doing the most with what you do the best. Parents, I think, would do well to give that kind of counsel to kids, perhaps moms in particular. Moms telling their children, "You know what, honey? Just do what you love to do so well that people will pay you for it." And spouses would probably do equally as well to urge their mate to choose satisfaction over salary. Better to be married to a happy person who has a thin wallet than a miserable person with a thick one. Besides, this showy life is an empty life. A plain and simple life is full of life. So pursue the value of contentment. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." So church, when choosing or changing jobs or stations in life or various options that might be laid before you, just be careful. My encouragement would be to, first of all, consult your design, who God made you to be, and then consult your designer. But you ought not to consult greed, because it makes for a pretty poor job counselor. Moms are good at sharing those kinds of lessons with us. I know my mom did, and hopefully you had a mom that had wisdom and was willing to share that with you. And today a nation sets aside a Sunday to remember our moms. So let's honor them. Let's thank them. Let's bless them as we can. I know some of you probably don't have mothers any longer, or the mothers you had were not really good moms. And there's no changing that. But there is changing who you are and who you are as a mom, or who and how you deal with other mothers that you come into contact with. But regardless, wish them a happy Mother's Day. Moms could use that pat on the back, and moms-to-be as well. So we've chosen a song, All to Jesus I Surrender. It's hard to surrender. We don't want to give ourselves up, especially when we have greed driving us from the other direction, because taking less means abdicating what you could have. But sometimes the getting of more results in losing much more than you would ever hope to have gained. So we're going to stand and sing this song. At the conclusion of this song, we'll talk about your prayer requests, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and sing, please.